The photograph was taken on a bitter winter morning in 1941, somewhere in the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky. 7 figures stand outside a sagging wooden cabin, staring at the camera with expressions that never learned what joy looked like. Their eyes are pale, almost colorless, as if the blood that once carried life had thinned over generations of the same name marrying itself. The wind had died that morning, or so the photographer later claimed, yet something behind the family moved, a faint, blurred outline in the window that no one remembered standing there. For years, no one in the county dared speak of the Hartleys. Their land was avoided, their name carved into no tombstone. What happened after that photograph was taken was called an accident, a tragedy, and finally, something better left alone. But the image survived. Passed quietly between collectors and historians, it surfaced whenever someone forgot to be afraid of it. Each time it did, the same pattern followed: lights flickered, voices whispered, and someone stopped sleeping altogether. The Hartleys had died once in 1941, but their photograph never did. It waited. And now, after nearly a century, it has surfaced again. The photograph that ended 7 lives is looking for new faces. In the spring of 1979, the rain had been falling over Harlan County for nearly a week straight, turning the earth into a deep, unsteady mire that swallowed boot heels and memory alike. When the County Historical Society received word that an old farmhouse was being cleared for demolition, they sent a quiet, meticulous man named Walter Green to inspect it for artifacts worth preserving. The house, he was told, had once belonged to a family no one wanted to talk about: the Hartleys. The structure leaned into itself, the porch rotted and bowed like an old man's spine, and the front door hung off one hinge, croaking each time the wind moved through it. Inside, the air was thick with mold and a faint metallic scent that Walter couldn't quite name. He climbed the narrow staircase carefully, each step giving a weary sigh beneath his weight, until he reached the attic, a cramped room with walls lined in warped boards and a single narrow window that looked out over a field gone feral with weeds. There, in the dust and quiet, Walter found a wooden chest pushed up against the wall. The lock had long since rusted away, and when he opened it, the smell of age and damp paper rose like a ghost. Inside were small, ordinary things: a child's shoe, a porcelain doll missing an eye, a cracked hand mirror, but buried beneath these relics lay a thick, leather-bound Bible, its cover soft and darkened by years of handling. When he lifted it, something slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. It was a photograph, black and white, curled slightly at the edges, the surface smudged with fingerprints so faint they seemed to move when the light shifted. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, *Hartley Family, 1941. Walter turned it over, and what he saw rooted him to the floor. 7 people stood outside a wooden cabin much like the one he was standing in, stiff, unsmiling, arranged in a line that felt more like a warning than a portrait. There was a man in the center, gaunt and towering, with 2 women beside him who looked nearly identical. 3 children stood before them, and an older woman sat in a rocking chair with hands folded in her lap. But what unsettled Walter most was the figure in the background, half seen, caught in the cabin window. It wasn't quite human, not quite shadow, and yet it seemed to be looking directly at him. The air in the attic grew colder, heavy with something that hadn't been there before, and though Walter couldn't explain why, he felt as if he'd just opened something that had been waiting for a very long time to be found. When Walter took the photograph back to his small office at the Harlan County Historical Society, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was wrong somehow, not simply eerie, but *incorrect*, as though the image itself refused to behave like it should. He laid it under the lamplight and studied it closely, using a magnifying glass to trace the edges of each face. The 7 Hartleys were perfectly still, frozen in the stiff formality of an old portrait, but one of them, the youngest boy, appeared slightly blurred. At first, Walter assumed it was due to the limitations of early cameras, which required subjects to hold their pose for long exposure times. But when he looked closer, he saw the faintest suggestion of movement, the blur following the angle of the child's head, as if he had turned to look at something just outside the frame in the last instant before the shutter closed. The rest of the family's expressions did not shift. They seemed utterly unaware that anything had moved at all. What disturbed him even more was the light. The family stood outdoors beneath an overcast sky, yet the direction of the shadows made no sense. They fell in opposite directions, thin and pale, as though lit by more than one source. The photographer's own shadow did not appear anywhere in the image, and in the far right corner, barely visible, was what looked like a streak of brightness bending toward the cabin, almost like the glint of glass, or the reflection of eyes. The longer Walter stared, the more the photograph seemed to shift beneath his gaze. He caught himself imagining that the figures were breathing faintly, that their eyes, empty and unfocused, were turning toward him one by one. When he showed the photograph to a colleague the following morning, she frowned and said it gave her a headache, that something about the contrast was off. Yet when Walter tried to make a copy of it, the darkroom light flickered and the paper came out blank, as if the photograph refused to be reproduced. The original seemed to hold a weight, a residue of the moment it had captured. Every time he touched it, the air in the room cooled by a few degrees. By the third day, Walter stopped sleeping. He claimed he could hear faint mechanical clicks in the silence of his home, the soft rhythm of a camera shutter opening and closing somewhere just beyond sight. The photograph, he began to believe, had not merely recorded an image, it had preserved something else, something that still lingered in the emulsion, waiting for the right pair of eyes to look too long. In Harlan County, stories about the Hartley family had been whispered for generations, though no one ever told them the same way twice. Older residents spoke their name with a careful distance, lowering their voices as though saying it too loudly might call something unwanted to attention. The Hartleys, they said, lived deep in the wooded hills near the Cumberland River, far from town and far from the sight of strangers. No one recalled seeing them at church, nor at the general store, and yet their smoke could sometimes be seen curling above the trees on cold mornings. The family had always kept to themselves, a habit that eventually became a reputation. Children were warned to stay away from the old Hartley land, and travelers who lost their way in the hills were said to have seen strange lights glowing where no lamps should burn. Rumors grew like weeds in the dark. Some said the Hartleys didn't let outsiders near because they were ashamed of how their children looked. Others said they weren't quite right in the head, that too many generations had been born of the same blood. The local doctor, long dead by the time Walter uncovered the photograph, had supposedly refused to make calls out to the property after one winter visit in 1936. He returned pale and trembling, claiming that what he'd seen there wasn't illness but consequence. Whatever he meant by that, he never elaborated. The older folks remembered that the family had once been large brothers, cousins, uncles, all living within a few miles of each other, but over time their numbers dwindled until only the 7 in the photograph remained. By the time 1941 came, most of the Hartleys were ghosts in name only, their cabin left to rot under the slow crawl of vines. The rare postman who dared ride the path up to their door described it as deathly quiet, save for the echo of his own horse's steps. And yet, there was always a sense of being watched. Even decades later, when the younger generations of the county had all but forgotten them, the land where the Hartleys once lived was avoided. Hikers who strayed near the old property line spoke of feeling sudden nausea, of hearing a soft hum like the winding of a camera. Some swore they saw faint figures moving in the trees, watching from the fog. The townsfolk dismissed it as imagination, but beneath the laughter there remained the same unspoken rule: the Hartleys were a story that didn't end right, a family that should have disappeared long before anyone thought to take their picture. When Walter began researching the Hartleys after finding the photograph, he expected to uncover a straightforward lineage, birth records, marriage licenses, perhaps an obituary or two, but what he found instead was a silence so absolute it felt deliberate. In the county's archives, their name appeared clearly on every census record up until 1941. There were entries for each of the 7 family members: Thomas Hartley, head of household, aged 52, 2 women listed as his kin, their exact relation left blank, and 4 children, all with the same surname but curiously marked with identical birth years only a few months apart. Then, in the following decade's census, the Hartleys were gone. Not relocated, not misspelled, not moved to another district, simply gone. The address where their cabin had stood was left blank, and a faint pencil note in the margin read, *uninhabitable property. Walter searched death certificates next, expecting to find a record of their passing, but none existed. There were no burial permits, no funeral notices, no mention of the family in the county newspaper except for a brief and cryptic line printed in the summer of 1941. Local residents report the Hartley place abandoned. After that, nothing. It was as though the entire bloodline had been erased overnight. Even the local church ledgers, which dutifully noted baptisms and deaths for decades, skipped the Hartley name completely after that year. The only evidence that the family had ever existed were the records themselves, frozen in 1941, and the photograph Walter now kept locked in his desk drawer. He began asking questions around town, but the few old-timers still alive grew uneasy whenever he mentioned the family. One man, who had been a deputy's son back in the 40s, told Walter that a county official had once been sent to the Hartley property to verify their absence for tax purposes. The man never filed his report. When his horse returned without him, a second officer rode out and found the property empty, the door swinging open, the furniture overturned, and a strange residue coating the windows like dried ash. The officer burned his uniform afterward and never spoke of it again. By the end of his research, Walter had the unsettling impression that someone or something had gone to great lengths to wipe the Hartleys from history. Their names remained only where records had been too old or too neglected to alter. The space they had occupied in the county's memory was hollow, but not cleanly so. It felt disturbed, as if beneath the layers of dust and forgotten paper, something still lingered, waiting to be acknowledged once more. In the first weeks of 1941, when the air was still sharp with frost and the dirt roads were little more than veins of frozen mud, a stranger came to the hills. No one knew his name for certain, though some believed he introduced himself simply as the photographer. He was a man in his mid-30s, lean from travel, his coat frayed at the cuffs, and his camera packed neatly in a worn leather case he carried like a relic. He moved through the rural outskirts of Kentucky offering portraits to families too poor to have ever owned one, trading photographs for meals, a night's shelter, or a few coins. Those who met him before he reached the Hartley property described him as quiet but pleasant, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, his grey eyes reflecting whatever light they caught. When he found the Hartley homestead, it was by accident. His horse had gone lame, and he followed the sound of a creek, hoping to find water, when he saw smoke rising from a chimney that looked half collapsed under the weight of snow. The family greeted him with suspicion at first. Thomas Hartley, the patriarch, stood on the porch with a rifle slung over his arm, while the rest of the family lingered in the shadows of the doorway. Yet when the stranger offered to take their picture, a keepsake, he said, of their lives as they were, Thomas seemed to hesitate. A photograph, he murmured, might prove they'd been real. They invited him in that night, fed him stew that tasted faintly of iron and herbs, and spoke little during the meal. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and something sour underneath it. The stranger noticed how they all looked at one another before answering any question, as if seeking silent permission. By morning, he set up his tripod outside, aligning the family against the bleak winter landscape. The Hartleys arranged themselves wordlessly, their movements slow and deliberate, and when he asked them to smile, no one did. He pressed the shutter and heard the faint click echo longer than it should have, like the camera itself had sighed. Afterward, he thanked them, promising to return with a developed copy within a fortnight. But he never did. Some said he left before dawn, unsettled by what he'd captured. Others believed the family asked him not to return, that something in the photograph had shown them more than they wished to see. Whatever the truth, that portrait became the last trace of both the stranger and the Hartleys, an image that seemed to swallow the light the moment it was taken, holding within it a silence that time would never completely erase. Within weeks of the photograph being taken, something in the Hartley household began to unravel. Neighbors, those who lived far enough to feel safe gossiping about the family, spoke of a change that settled over their land like an early frost. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The livestock, once heard lowing in the evenings, fell silent. The mailman who rode the ridge past their property swore he saw figures moving in the windows long after nightfall, but when he called out, the shapes froze and vanished from view. By the third week, no one in the county could recall seeing any of the Hartleys outside their cabin. Even the crows stopped circling overhead, and hunters said the woods around the property had gone unnaturally still. When a group of men finally worked up the courage to investigate, they found the house sealed from the inside. The front door resisted them until the hinges splintered, revealing a darkness so thick it felt alive. Inside, the air was heavy, carrying a bitter, metallic odor that clung to their throats. The hearth was cold, but there were bowls of untouched food still sitting on the table, as though the family had been called away in the middle of supper. The only sound came from the steady drip of water somewhere deeper in the house. What they found in the rooms defied easy telling. Each of the 7 Hartleys was discovered in a different part of the home, positioned in ways that made no sense, one kneeling by the window, another lying beneath the staircase, 2 huddled in the corner of the attic with their hands clasped as if in prayer. There were no signs of violence, no struggle, no marks on their skin, yet every face was frozen in the same expression. Eyes wide, mouths slightly parted, as if they had seen something they could neither understand nor escape. The sheriff's report later described the deaths as inconclusive. No poison, no wounds, no cause. The local coroner refused to handle the bodies and insisted they be buried immediately, claiming the odor in the house made him dizzy and confused. The townspeople obliged, digging 7 graves on a grey afternoon and marking them with plain wooden crosses. Within a year, the crosses were gone, whether stolen, rotted, or deliberately removed, no one knew. But the house remained, its windows dark and unbroken, until one summer storm struck it with lightning and burned it to the ground. Some claimed the flames burned too bright, that the fire gave off no smoke at all. Others said they heard the sound of a camera shutter in the distance, just once, before the roof collapsed. The man who took the Hartley family photograph was never seen alive again after that winter. In the months that followed the discovery of the 7 bodies, talk of the stranger spread through the county like fog. Some claimed he had been a drifter, a harmless artist moving from town to town. Others whispered he was something else entirely, a man who didn't leave footprints in the snow and never cast much of a shadow. What was certain was that he had vanished without collecting the payment Thomas Hartley had promised him: a modest meal, a few coins, and a place to rest the next time he passed through. When a deputy traced the photographer's last known route, he found remembered him after the day he rode toward the Hartley cabin. His name was not written in any guest books, no one developed his film, and no body had been claimed under his description. It wasn't until late spring that a fisherman downstream, miles from where the Hartleys had lived, spotted something caught against the rocks. It was a leather case, waterlogged and torn open at the seams. Inside were fragments of ruined film and a small notebook whose ink had mostly bled away. Only a few words remained legible on the final page, scrawled in a hand that shook as it wrote, *. It blinked. Days later, the man who found the case told authorities he couldn't sleep, that each night he dreamt of a dark room where 7 pale figures stood waiting for him to lift a camera. He drowned himself in the same river 3 weeks after reporting his discovery. The authorities eventually recovered what they believed was the photographer's body farther downstream. The current had taken its toll, his face was nearly unrecognizable, the eyes open, lips drawn tight as though caught mid-word. In his coat pocket was a single glass plate negative, miraculously intact despite the water damage. When it was developed, it revealed not the Hartley portrait but something else, an image of the same cabin, empty this time, with the door hanging open and faint silhouettes in the window that seemed to stare outward. The negative was sealed in evidence, and within a few years, the file vanished along with it. Locals said the river still ran colder where his body was found, and on quiet nights, those who lived nearby swore they could hear the faint click of a camera echoing over the water, repeating at steady intervals, like a warning no one could decipher. The photograph did not rest quietly after the Hartleys' deaths. 4 decades it drifted from one set of hands to another, passing through collectors, archivists, and amateur historians who each thought they had found nothing more than a curious relic of rural tragedy. Yet every person who handled it noticed something that made them uneasy. Some said the air around it felt heavier, that the temperature of the room dropped when it was taken out of its sleeve. Others claimed they could hear faint sounds, almost imperceptible, when they looked at it for too long, a low hum or the soft click of a camera shutter echoing from somewhere nearby. At first, they dismissed these sensations as imagination, tricks of nerves or light, but small, inexplicable incidents began to follow. One woman reported hearing a child's laughter outside her house each night, though she lived miles from anyone else. Another man swore that faces appeared in the mirrors of his darkroom, watching him develop prints that refused to dry. The most persistent account came from a researcher who acquired the photograph in the early 1960s. He noted that, under magnification, the expressions of the family seemed to change from week to week. In one image, the boy's eyes appeared open. In another, they looked half-lidded, as though closing in exhaustion. The researcher tried photographing the original print for documentation, but every attempt failed. His cameras jammed, the negatives came out black, and once, the entire roll melted inside the canister. Convinced the photograph held some form of chemical contamination, he stored it in a sealed box, but that same night he woke to the smell of burning film and found the box open, the photo lying face up on the floor beside his bed. Over time, those who came into contact with the photograph suffered similar disturbances, voices whispering their names, faint footsteps in rooms they knew were empty, and the distinct sense that something unseen was moving just beyond their field of vision. More than one person who studied it long enough reported seeing new details emerge within the frame, an unfamiliar shadow in the window, or an eighth figure standing behind the family that hadn't been there before. A few claimed to see the outline of the photographer himself reflected faintly in the glass, as though whoever, or whatever, had captured the Hartleys had never truly stepped out of the picture. The photograph seemed less like an image frozen in time and more like a window that occasionally looked back. The historian who discovered the photograph in 1979, Walter Green, became its final known owner. After months of studying it, he had grown pale and restless, his colleagues noticing how he jumped at small sounds and often stared into empty corners as though listening to something no one else could hear. He began to keep the photograph locked in his office drawer during the day, but at night he claimed he could hear the faint creak of the drawer sliding open by itself. He stopped coming to work after one particularly stormy night when the janitor found him sitting alone in the archives, the lights off, the photograph spread across his desk beneath a single flickering bulb. Walter insisted he was close to uncovering what really happened to the Hartleys. His notes from that week were scattered and erratic references to faces in the darkroom light, breath on glass, and a phrase written over and over again, *it's watching again. When he didn't show up for work the following Monday, the police were called to his small house at the edge of town. The front door was locked from the inside, the curtains drawn. Nothing appeared disturbed, no signs of struggle, no forced entry, but Walter was gone. The only thing left behind was his tape recorder, still running on its side atop his desk. When the officers pressed play, they heard the low hum of static, broken by the sound of Walter's voice murmuring as if speaking to someone across the room. His words were disjointed at first, something about light exposure, about the reflection not matching the subjects. Then came silence, a faint scraping noise, and finally a whisper so faint it barely registered on the tape. It repeated a single phrase, over and over, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, don't look. The photograph itself was missing. His desk drawers were empty, the walls stripped bare except for the faint rectangular outline where a picture frame had once hung. Neighbors told police that, on the night before his disappearance, they saw flashes of light coming from his window at irregular intervals, like a camera firing in the dark. One even claimed she heard laughter, soft, childlike, echoing from somewhere deep inside the house. Despite an extensive search, no trace of Walter Green was ever found. Months later, his car was discovered abandoned near the old Hartley property, its interior soaked from rain, his camera on the passenger seat with the lens cracked clean down the middle. The negatives inside were blank except for one, which showed nothing but a set of 7 faint outlines standing in the fog, waiting. In the spring of 2025, the photograph surfaced again, this time at a private estate auction in Charleston. It was listed under the unassuming title *cursed, the Hartley family portrait, with no provenance, no seller's name, and no explanation of how it had survived the decades since Walter Green's disappearance. The auctioneer described it as an object of historical curiosity, and despite his flippant tone, he refused to handle it with bare hands. Those who attended the preview said the photograph was unlike any other artifact in the collection. Its surface was dull, almost matte, but under certain light it seemed to shimmer faintly, like the reflection of water. The image itself looked unchanged from its earlier descriptions, 7 figures standing in the cold outside their cabin, but there was something different about it now. The cabin in the background appeared darker, as though time itself had seeped into the print. Some swore they saw movement when they turned their heads away, a suggestion that the shadows within the photograph were not entirely still. When bidding opened, a hush fell over the room. Only a handful of collectors raised their paddles, and each one hesitated before doing so, as if they felt the air grow heavier around them. The photograph sold to an anonymous buyer for a modest sum, but no one saw the buyer's face. The representative who collected it wore gloves and left before the auction ended. That night, the auctioneer's assistant, who had helped pack the item, called in sick, claiming she couldn't sleep and that every time she closed her eyes, she saw a camera flash. She was found the next morning standing motionless in her apartment doorway, murmuring that the people in the photograph had moved closer. Within weeks, the image began circulating online. A scan of it appeared on a collector's forum, and then across social media, accompanied by strange reports, users claiming their screens flickered or their webcams activated on their own after viewing it. Some insisted that when they zoomed in, they saw an eighth figure reflected faintly in the glass, holding a camera pointed outward. The photo's origin thread was soon deleted, the account wiped clean, but the file had already spread far beyond its source. Experts tried to trace the digital copy back to the original, but every attempt led to corrupted data. Those who continued searching reported hearing faint mechanical clicks from their speakers, though no sound was being played. The Hartley photograph had escaped the confines of film and paper, crossing into a world full of new eyes willing to look too long. And once it was seen, it was never unseen again.